Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to Joe and IO for the invite. It's always good to talk about our business, and it's really easy to talk about because we live and breathe it. So I'm the Director of Commodity Support Services, which includes Lidar Supply Limited, and very much for the LCST contract, which means Logistics, Commodities and Services Transformation Programme. A programme that I'll tell you a bit more about later. But this is on behalf of Leidos, who won the contract back in 2015, actually. So 3 years implementation and then 10 years steady state. Within this session, we're not really going to talk about Leidos and we're not going to talk about the program too much. We're going to really talk about the supply chains within that, which are in some ways quite complex supply chains. But it's really about the entry to the supply chain, the engagement, and then the through life management of it, making sure that suppliers are really engaged, informed, and can contribute from their side as well as ours. So really a mutual arrangement. So what we're really going to do is have a bit of a LCST overview. Some of you may know LCST, some of you may not, but it gives you a good chance to have a look at that. Then commodity support services within LCST, and then understanding the supply chain within that, which is the real crux of this. And then clearly we'll come to questions. As I said, we're just going to cover these 3 topics. Let's get into LCST. So basically LCST is, as I said, 13-year contract. We've got 70,000 NATO stock numbers, which are just items for those not in the defence environment. And we hold about 750,000 live NSNs, but they're not all within my sphere. I have about 50,000 and probably about 27,000 go into the DFC that you can see on the top right-hand corner. These are managed by a number of suppliers that we'll come on to. But really, the infrastructure is to enable there to be direct supply straight out to a unit from a supplier and into the warehouse so we can take it from stock and inventory. LCST is very much around a prime contract with Leidos Europe. And then we look at commodity support services, which is TVS, one of our partner companies, has the category management, inventory and commodity management. And we'll come a bit more onto that. Whereas Lidar Supply manages all the contracts of those items that we need to actually deliver against for frontline command into the warehouse or direct supply. Most of the activity does go through what we call the DFC, the Defence Fulfilment Centre. There are a number of warehouses, 35 in total, but they are being rationalised over the course of time. So we should see in time to come some other major warehouses, but at the moment, the main site for us is the new build under LCST for the Donington site, which is the fulfilment centre. So quite an interesting construct, but all the suppliers of the commodities sit within this commodity support services. Commodity support services is actually a virtual organisation purely constructed for LCST. So 2 real companies, TVS and Lidar Supply. There's no contract between those companies. They both go into the prime, but the virtual organisation are managed as a team. And there's about 280 people in that team. And we'll come on to a bit more detail later. Working very, very closely with storage, distribution and freight to make sure whatever we're procuring to go into that DFC should enter the DFC seamlessly. We receipt it, they put it away, we pay the supplier. Quite a seamless process, and a lot of it very automated now. So that's basically the overview. When we come on to commodity support services itself, this is a really busy slide and you will receive a copy of these slides. But if we go from, as you look at the screen, right to left, what we're really looking at under LCST for commodity support services, we have commodity management, which is really about what do we buy? What do we need to buy for frontline command? We then look at inventory management and when do we need to buy it? So we have very automated systems and some intelligence that tells us what to buy and when to buy it. and we will actually rely on demand forecasting, but that's a lot less of an influence than our own data. So a lot of it is data managed. And then we look at how do we buy it through our category team. And this is really the engagement with suppliers. How do we reach those markets and those suppliers that could actually deliver this? And we'll come on to it a bit later, but there's a lot of work being created to actually investigate bringing in SMEs more and more, and making sure that these opportunities are open to everybody, whether you're a small organisation or whether you're a large organisation in the UK or outside of the UK. And this is all coupled together with putting these into frameworks. We don't have contracts as such, we have frameworks, but these frameworks are enablers to allow us to have the flexibility around the volumes and the values we want, even though for a supplier, that's a lot of challenge, and we can discuss that. The areas we cover as we go across the screen into the commodity areas, medical. We're actually undertaking a medical transformation program at the moment, really understanding what does the customer need, rather than what we were contracted for, because there's always nuances in contracts that look at those requirements. So we've really worked with the medical customer to try and understand what do they need, when do they need it. Food is something similar. We have a food working group with the customer to make sure that we're delivering food, whether that be fresh food or ration packs or ambient food, anywhere in the world, the food is delivered, and we can manage that. And again, working with the customer, we've changed ration packs to be of a more protein-enhanced ration. We've looked at lots of sustainability around packaging to make sure that we're aligned with the environmental challenges we have. Clothing, we're actually the commodity technical authority. So we look at the patterns and the texture of the cloth and the materials. We've also worked with a lot of the clothing suppliers to really understand their supply chains and the number of, if you like, MOQs they need against material, storage of that material, environments to store that material, to make sure that we can keep the cost down, but also make sure the supply chain can flow properly. And then general supplies, which is a vast amount of items, everything from glue to fuels and more. And general supplies is probably one of the most complex areas because of the number of different NSNs within it. So as you can see, we've got core functions. Within those core functions, now we've restructured ourselves. So we're looking into the customer and into the supply chain. And we have 4 commodity areas, which is really the makeup of the 50,000 NSNs. So as we move through this, what did we inherit? We really inherited a number of contracts. We had about 182 when we started. The spend was not dissimilar to what we see today. The NSNs, there were more NSNs than we see today because we've rationalized, and suppliers were about 600. Where we are today, we have about 800 registered suppliers. And when I say registered, that actually means we've used them maybe once, or they've shown an interest and we've have them logged in our system. So a supplier for us is not just somebody who's got a framework, but somebody who may be able to deliver one or many elements of the contracts that we have. We have a number of off-contract purchases, and they've come in various forms. Some of the work around Ukraine, that has created opportunities for suppliers that were maybe not big enough to actually take a contract themselves. But there's been small areas of products that we've needed for Ukraine, for example, and we've procured them through these suppliers. So really good to understand the suppliers and their portfolios. And it's always incredible to understand some of the portfolios and how wide they are, how vast they are. We've rationalized the NSNs because there were many obsolete items. We've taken military off-the-shelf items and turned them into COTS items, which has driven value for money, but also made sure supply chains are more effective and more agile, because we're not looking at that military packaging, for example. We've worked with the customer to make sure that we don't need that military packaging. Or waterproof socks is a great example. Waterproof socks were always military off the shelf, and we've now turned those into COTS because they're the same specification. Along with working with the employees. So we had a number of 2P employees came across to us. Some of through age of employment, they've retired or moved on, but we have the capability, we've expanded our capability, and all of our procurement people are SIPS qualified now. Many have MBAs or masters in supply chain. So we've done a lot of investment into people to make sure that they manage their supply chain. A number of people have done MBAs across supply performance, which has been really useful for our development. And all of these contracts are governed by, some of you will understand, public procurement regulations, which is at the heart of many conversations at the moment because of PCR 24 coming in. So a really interesting time right now. So how does this all actually work together? Well, what we've tried to do in Leidos Supply is try to make the entry into the market as seamless as possible. We use a system called Jagger. And what this does enable is for suppliers to register and look at all the opportunities coming up. We often put in 12 to 18 months to make sure, even though some of the dates might slip, we like to make sure that suppliers understand what's coming. You can register for free, so that's really easy. You get things like password, which is an ideal one, and you can reset that yourself. Jagger themselves actually offer a support line, and all the opportunities that we put on there, you can just express an interest, or you can go further and come to industry days, because we put these on and we talk about that a bit later. But the portal is really, really easy to use. There's a lot of information on there. And we've tried to make sure that suppliers, whether they're already involved in LCST or we're advertising the fact that we've got this portal, and we do that often between speaking on Made in Britain and events such as this as well. But we actually make sure that suppliers do know this is the way to do it. And if there's any further help needed, then we will offer that from our own organisation. We've got many of our team who are SMEs in this portal. So along with that, we've really investigated the supply chain and making sure SMEs in particular, but all suppliers, but SMEs in particular, have the opportunity to engage with us and undertake some of these contracts. Some of them are huge, and we understand that, but there are many that are much smaller, and suppliers are able to engage with it. We've actually undertaken a SME action plan, and there's 13 different objectives in that action plan to make sure that we address such things as entry into opportunities. We understand industry days where there might be challenges around trying to get suppliers to come to industry days. So we've looked at alternative mediums to actually conduct those. We present at and hold a stand at things like DSEI and various exhibitions to make sure that we're accessible. Specifically around ceremonial, which is quite a unique market, we've held parliamentary receptions to ensure that SMEs have that sort of showcase and they can show those items that they produce. And we have commodity manufacturing visits, which often means that our teams go out to places like China, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., to look at the end-to-end manufacturing, but also to seek out other suppliers that might be in those regions. There's been some success in this. We've actually increased our overall SME percentage up to about 51% now, and that does flex year on year depending on what contracts we're letting, but it always sits well above the target of 33. One of the things we do recognise is that the tender process in any defence organisation under public procurement is tough, and outside of that particular tender being run, we will take suppliers through how they actually would complete a tender without it being too laborious, too mandrolic. So if any supplier was concerned about that, we can take them through that because it's in our best interest to do this. But the action plan is readily available. We'll send it out with the link if anybody's interested in it. But it really hits at the heart of trying to make sure SMEs have the best chance of entering into the business. We recognise defence is a tough business to get into. So in terms of what do we do with relationship to supplier relation management, we do have a head of supplier relationship, and they cut across our customer relationship, our teams that I talked about earlier, and they have the supplier relationship senior board that we look at any risks and issues and any highlights of our suppliers. We have an SRM supplier relationship management approach, and a lot of this is now really against each of the segments that you can see on the slide. We've undertaken our segmentation, and that has really, in a collaborative manner, really worked well to understand why do we need those strategic suppliers right down to the tactical suppliers. And once we did that, we were able to then take the data and do some benchmarking. We also do a level of balanced scorecards internally, and we look at things like measurement of OTIF and performance, because part of our contract is measured against that, but equally, it helps us with those lessons learned. So we have our approach. We have a policy that sits against that as well, which I'll come on to a bit later. But also we have a structured management, which means that we have a portal which is real-time data and is accessible via a supplier portal. Works very well. It's been working for the last at least 8 years. And we have continuous improvement initiatives. So we have a team that look at best business practice. And we've undertaken, certainly in the last 2 years, a real hard view at supplier relationship management and making sure that we can continue our performance, but also react to things like the Black Swan event and surge with those suppliers that we know have the ability to do that. Because not all suppliers do have the ability to react because of the supply chains and because of the size of them. But we've taken that into account. The other area we look at, and is hugely important, is collaborative engagement. So we have a structured process, we have some policies, and we have the right teams in place. What we've really looked at over the last couple of years is that face-to-face engagement. Clearly, COVID stopped some of that, but we're back into that space. We have engagement at all levels, right down from desk level to QA to risk management to finance and up to senior level, where we actually have discussions and decisions around innovation. And this is where a lot of our sustainability actions have come from. We look right across the supply chains. So we look, and most recently we've been looking at the defence clothing supply chain, because we need to make sure that we understand the lower tiers, and also in conjunction with understanding the defence capability. So within the UK, we talk a lot about resilience and making sure we have a resilient supply chain. But generally speaking, I think most of us would recognise that most of it comes from outside of the UK. So we're really looking at how we can understand and establish more of those relationships to make sure that we can react to, as I said, surge and events that do happen. This collaboration also helps us drive levels of innovation across technology as well. So we look at those products and see if there's any way they can be modernized, certainly in that ceremonial space again. And a bit like we talked about food, where the protein was the thing we needed. And I'm sure packaging was another area that came out of innovation. So it's really good to have that collaborative engagement, and also to help those suppliers come into the market to make sure that they've got that opportunity. And with those relationships, we also find that the through life management is much better because you've established a relationship early on. And I think there is an emphasis on early on, because you need to establish those relationships to make sure that Where there are challenging times, you can work it out together. You can go through the process. Yes, there is a contract in place, but we would prefer to actually talk to each other and make sure that we understand the risks that we hold when we do go through some of those issues. So what does that really mean in terms of our delivery focus? Supplier performance is key, because we're looking to actually right across the supply chains into the DFC and back out to the frontline command. Supplier performance is critical. We've undertaken some areas of extending lead times, and this is really to make sure that we can really look at on-time in full and meet the frontline command challenge. We look at resilience, making sure there's continuity of supply to the customer, which is resilience without just loading the inventory warehouse. It has to be a continuous supply chain. And we've tried to make sure there's such things as forward buys on material to ensure that the supplier has enough of the materials they need to make either the garments or the products to actually deliver into us. And some of those can be short lead times once we've got that material in. One of the other things we've really looked at is the joined up quality approach. So there's things like first off production. So when we have a mass of volume of items, our teams will go in country, wherever that might be, and it could be India, Cambodia, wherever it needs to be, they will go and see that first off production to make sure that whilst we go through tender, we will get a specific sample, which may be perfect, but when you come to volume production, then they need a different manufacturing house. So that the teams will go, and in doing so, they will check the garment and also check out things like corporate social responsibility to make sure that they absolutely align. And some of this also aligns with the defence supply chain strategy, which was rolled out 2 years ago. And it certainly aligns to the newly formed, and it is quite newly formed, the Defence Supply Chain Capability Programme, which we'll certainly be trying to get involved in, because that seems to be a really key strategy, really around having one defence, one version of defence, and trying to make sure that we align to that, which includes all the things that we're talking about here, whether it's supply chain performance, value for money, sustainability. It will fit into that supply chain capability program. So we'll be very much aligned to that. And if anybody's interested and is unaware of it, please let us know and we'll give you the links for that. But yes, these are the key delivery focuses for us. I think sustainability has been great success for us within our supply chain. We've had things like paper menus removed and the menu is printed on the side of the box. We've had plastic packaging, single-use packaging removed and made more appropriate. So, for example, with ration packs, the frontline command can actually take the plastic bag, reseal it, and use it for things like wet socks or wet clothes. So there's a second use for it and a third use sometimes. So there's many different aspects of sustainability that we've undertaken, and we've captured all of these. One of the really interesting ones is moving from a plastic or wooden fork and spoon when we provide the ORP. What we now have is a potato starch fork, which is a spoon and fork together, which is a great innovation and a great sustainability item, which has been really successful in the use as well. So that's the delivery focus. If we move on to the through life management, and I grant you this is not the best slide to see, but you'll see it when we release it. We pulled a policy together and we really looked at what are the 5 steps that we need to work through to make sure that we can actually deliver this. And it was also to make sure that we went from concept to execution while we captured through life learning and making sure that we could implement that learning, because so many lessons learned, the implementation is often missed out. So we undertook this policy to just break it right down. And some of the language in here is our own language, like A3, which is the pre-concept stage, and CAB, which is our contract approval board, which has been running for, again, 8 years. And what this does is look at every single tender at every stage, making sure that it is appropriate for market, and then the evaluation is conducted properly, compliantly against public procurement regulations, and satisfactory in terms of driving value for money and capable of delivery. We then also look at the supplier mapping, and we actually map our suppliers. So we have all suppliers mapped, all 160 plus, certainly down to tier 2, often down to tier 3, and some down to tier 4. So if something like a Suez Canal happens, we know that those suppliers are in that vicinity and how we would need to redirect those suppliers, which then folds back into the defence strategy about how to actually revert to a new process if there is some worldwide issue being undertaken. And because we have this mapping, we understand how we could actually divert a supplier to actually come in through a different method, or maybe use a different supply chain totally, because they won't be able to get the products through to us. So we've mapped every supplier. And then we have collaborative performance monitoring, which is really around making sure we understand the performance of a supplier, and the performance being, can they deliver on time? Have they delivered on time? And have we done everything we can to enable them to deliver on time? And most of the time, there will be challenges around, did we release a purchase order on time? Did we give them sufficient funding to actually buy their materials? And is, in circumstances of any geographical challenges, did they have enough time to deliver it? And we can step in quite often and air freight something instead of putting it on the sea because we need that item. But all of these things are looked at across our 49 strategic suppliers, which are in the top part of the triangle, because they're the suppliers that are delivering the volumes to us. We also have suppliers within there that actually have unique items. So we try and make sure that we look at both sides, and we hold these reviews with the suppliers and internally to look at the risks. And we hold these at least once a month with various different suppliers. So that collaborative performance monitoring is really crucial to the way we actually go forward. And it's also taught us to actually change some of the things in the tender, because they didn't work previously, or they were restrictive in the way we were operating. So these 5 steps are really crucial to us as part of our supply chain policy and planning. And they certainly feed into the success that we've seen today. And some of those successes are not only just across making sure that suppliers deliver on time, but making sure that there's a fair tender and a fair tender competition as well. And ultimately making sure frontline command receive the goods that they should receive when they want to receive them. And we've got enough stock in place, and we've got an agile enough supply chain to enable those deliveries. And there's been many successes. So whether we talk about Ukraine, or whether we talk about the Prince of Wales being furnished with food and medical supplies, or whether we talk about the coronation, there's been many successes in this. And one of our great successes that doesn't come along very often, and very sadly, was the Queen's funeral. But the success was that we were able to respond to that very quickly and prepare in short time for the coronation, which took about just over 25,000 items to be delivered in a very short time, including things like fresh sandwiches on the day being delivered at a very short notice. So there was a lot of things we undertook in this space of the funeral and the coronation. And one of the things we did, because of the short time scales and the complexity and the publicity that was coming with this whole operation, we actually took the customer, frontline command, and our supplier out to India to review the colours and standards that were being created, because a small amount of the activity had to be taken out to India to make sure we had capacity to deliver that, all managed by the UK supplier, which was hugely successful. But this was making sure that all parties were involved, The supplier was involved, the supply chain were involved, and we delivered that on time in full. So that's just one of the...
So I'm the chairman and founder of a company called MyR Limited. We are a defence SME and very much operating in some really niche spaces. I won't spend much time talking about us. I think it's important to try and share some of the lessons that we've uncovered over the last few years. I've been in defence industry for 15 years. I was in the Royal Air Force before that. Done some really interesting jobs. But fundamentally, this is about what have we learned, and trying to share some things here. What I'm sharing this evening is based upon a 3-year research program into innovation in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's quite a tough market to be in. It's quite specific, very niche, but specifically looking at the challenges in adoption of commercial space ISR, which is sort of a niche within a niche, really. But what this actually has taught us is an awful lot about how defence does business. If I could ask you to keep questions to the end of the session, as per Joe's previous instructions, that'd be helpful. But I want to give you a bit of a health warning. There's a chance this could come across as a bit of a rant, because there's quite a lot wrong with defence procurement, and particularly from a defence SME's perspective. Things are not necessarily as they should be, but also they're definitely not the way that I think our MOD colleagues believe them to be. So I'll try and highlight some of those challenges and definitely point at a different way of doing things towards the end of the presentation. The picture at the bottom there is our summer barbecue, where some of our team members brought their aeroplanes, which is quite good fun. And it was a joy watching some of our younger members go flying around the airfield in an 80-year-old aeroplane. We like to do that sort of thing. So what's MyR? It's essentially two SMEs merged together and rebranded. The primary company was a company called RJD Technology, founded in 2001, but we've now modernized and created a new capability. As 26 employees, we are technically a micro SME, but we're growing quite rapidly. We're twice the size we were last year, despite the conditions that exist around us. We've got a whole load of intelligence practitioners, joint warfare experts, systems engineers, research and test and evaluation specialists. We've got business security clearances. We hold our own. We've got personnel security clearances. I won't go into those in this call, but also all of the accreditations that you would expect a company of our size to have, and then some. I'll talk about frameworks. You can see across the bottom there's quite a few that we're already involved with, but also trade bodies such as Tech UK and ADS. I'm a big fan of ADS for our space, and they're a great advocate for SMEs. The sorts of things we do, we're essentially a problem-solving business. The sorts of places and things that characterize where and how we operate are challenging, messy problems, complicated, classified environments where it's difficult to get things done, things that require innovation and agility, and often new capabilities that provoke change. It's surprisingly, given how defence is in the business of protecting the UK and projecting power overseas and so on, there is a fairly hefty innovation or an aversion, to change, and there's often a need to help. So we've a quote from one of our program managers that works with us is, "We're the team that walks towards the fires rather than run away with them," which I've run away from, which I really like. So talking about some of the commercial challenges that we see then, certainly MED commercial is under significant pressure, and I think our Crown Servant colleagues will admit that the recent cuts to headcount have certainly not helped. We're seeing that cuts are continuing. The new 100% manning level is essentially what was 3 months ago, 70% resource level. And we're seeing gaps everywhere, and that's translating into some interesting behaviours and outcomes for the commercial world. We're certainly seeing considerable skills and experience fade. As I said, I've been working within industry for 15 years, and it's evident that because of the breadth of portfolios and the training and the skills and qualifications that our compatriots had 15 years ago, the turnover of manpower and the turnover of resources and people flowing in and out of the organisation, and flowing in and then flowing out to industry, is leaving significant challenges for our MED commercial partners. and the way that that's manifesting is certainly they don't have time to train. They don't have time to build up their experience. They don't spend time on multiple projects and learning at scale, which essentially sort of corrals them into being less adaptable and less capable potentially than their earlier peers. Now, I would be really clear here. This is not an ad hominem attack. This is not about criticizing the people involved. This is actually a systemic and organizational issue rather than being anything wrong with the people involved. They're doing their absolute best, and we see that every day. But it certainly feels to me that there is an experience fade from that I witnessed a while ago. Another challenge here is because they don't get the time to move between different programs and they tend to sit in one place for a period of time. Their knowledge of wider frameworks, supply chain management systems, acquisition. I mean, I was listening to Jaynie very carefully about how they manage their onward supply chain, and it's fascinating. The level of personal engagement is really heartening to see. I'm not sure the same exists within our M&E organisations that we work with. They tend to have a couple of framework areas that they work with continuously over a period of time, but knowledge of what frameworks could be available, what routes to market, what contract vehicles may be available for particular tasks is certainly less prevalent. And a lot of that manifests into a reticence to work with SMEs. I think they find us generally, we're quite pacey, we're quite agile, we're quite adaptable, but certainly we're not at the scale of companies that are used to working with. So the way that comes out is that we're viewed as being riskier to work with than the large primes. Some of us have worked in large primes. I've got experience of working in 2 big UK defence companies, internationals actually. And program delivery in our space is often late, often over budget, and usually there's some concessions made in terms of performance, and all of which contributes to risk in my view. And I think there's a strong case for the SMEs here, in that because we have fewer contracts, because we live on our reputations, we can't afford for our programs to go that way. And I think it's fair to say that although we might be viewed as being more risky because we're smaller, agile, perhaps less resource in terms of cash headroom and so on, we're motivated to succeed because we have to. And I briefed the MED Centre on that very subject recently, and it probably became the tipping point between getting a contract and not getting a contract, which is kind of interesting. I want to talk about frameworks. There is significant issues. There are significant issues in and around, kind of triggered by the fact that the MED doesn't have enough commercial staff to run these things. There has become a reliance on prime contractors to run frameworks, and the problem is that they all operate differently. We're on 8 different frameworks, and each one has differing entry criteria and barriers. They often have different purchasing and finance systems. So we're on CP&F for the MOD, we're on 2 different instances of Cooper, and we're on Ariba. So the finance director has to manage all of those systems. It's not unified in any way. And the net effect is that it creates an awful lot of overhead for everybody concerned. Interestingly, only the Engineering Delivery Partnership appears to use JOSCAR. And I'm going to make a wild assumption here that most people on this call are familiar with JOSCAR, but if you're not, it's a joint supply chain accreditation register, and in order to work on EDP you must be registered on JOSCAR, and it's pre-qualifying you as a supplier, and yet the MOD is signed up as a buyer on JOSCAR, and I've had to jump through another set of hoops this week with a thing called the Neutral Vendor Framework for Innovation, which asks a lot of the same pre-qualification questions as were asked on JOSCAR. So I don't understand why these things aren't connected. Why are we repeating work? Because clearly it's not efficient for the commercial staffs involved, but it's definitely not efficient for the SMEs. It becomes a wider challenge, I think. I talked about the cost of entry, but everyone as a high but differing cost of entry and with different data and evidence requirements. So some will require you to prove that you have ISO 9001 and ISO 27001 CE plus. Some are self-certifying, some don't care whether you have CE plus but definitely want CE, and they're all different. And I think there's a strong case here for trying to unify some of this. Maybe even within the Crown Commercial Services, that would be a logical place for in my view. We're also on that, G-Cloud and others. I'll move on to some governance challenges. I actually wrote one of the joint service publications that deals with imagery policy quite a few years ago, but I wrote it, so I understand how this works. And it seems to me that policy and governance always lags delivery and certainly lags innovation, but it's usually rearwards looking. It essentially looks at what we have today, how do we manage today, how do we manage yesterday, and very rarely does it set the conditions for future success. And unless, even more importantly, it fails to set the groundwork for innovation to be delivered, and particularly where innovation is hard to scope. We can talk about, we can describe the outcomes, but policy and governance is never led by innovation, and it's a real shame. And I think we need to figure out how to break that paradigm. And I've got some thoughts on that later. MAD procurement tends to be requirements-led rather than innovation-led, and it doesn't take much to spend some time looking at the war in Ukraine to see how fast innovation is being adopted on the battlefields, how fast the innovation is responded to by the opposing side, and then re-innovation on top of that. And it's essentially, most people looking at this would judge that there's essentially a 3-month cycle of advantage where a new innovation hits the battle space. It takes the opposition about 3 months to catch up and then regain their advantage, and the arms race continues. If we retain the position of always being requirements-led, so we have a need for a new tank, ship, aeroplane, whatever, and then we distill that into a set of requirements. It must fly this high, it must fly this fast, it must be able to carry this many weapons, and so on. We'll always lag. The requirement will be set, there will be the normal acquisition process will apply, and essentially what we're trying to do is hit a requirement that's old. And I think that if we can get into the space, and this won't work everywhere, but there are definitely some places, and information advantage is one of these, where if we could be led by innovation and allow the innovation to take defense into a new space, that would actually trigger more value to defense and allow us to regain the advantage over our adversaries. There are some cases, not everywhere, but some cases where compliance, the need for compliance, seems to have a vote greater than its component within the program. Larry and I are very much aware of a program that was close to our hearts, where a comment from the particular team leader relevant was, we're driving in exquisite compliance at the price of any kind of delivery. And that's a frustration. We want to be delivering capability rather than having a perfectly compliant system that you can't use. So and this applies to not only safety but security, any number of compliance areas, and it seemed to have a vote that sometimes a senior or responsible officer should be able to vote down. But some of these things seem to be outweighing the technical or the delivery requirements. And certainly at the moment, we're seeing increased scrutiny. I think it was no secret that in the summer, the Cabinet Office essentially dictated that within the defence digital world, that any new work that was over £50,000, over 50k, was required to be signed off by the Cabinet Office. The effect that had was to exert cost control and spend control, but to drive the timelines into an even slower pace, and it became more sluggish as each level of scrutiny was required to conduct their due diligence and get it to the Cabinet Office, which then took time. So everything went long, from qualification questionnaires to letting new contracts to going to the market, where actually the moment there was probably to accelerate rather than slow down. There is a belief, I think, that increased scrutiny exerts control, and therefore control equals controlling costs. I need to find more evidence for this, but I believe that actually in a lot of cases, the more you scrutinize and try and control something, the more that you're inducing cost creep within the program itself. And I can use a micro example here from my time in the Royal Air Force, where if you needed to travel overseas, you were required to get the approval of a 2-star officer. So you had to find the price of the ticket, go up through your command chain, which took usually a couple of weeks to get to the 2-star officer. It would then get approved or denied, and it would come back down. By the time that all that had happened, the price of the ticket had gone up, and you'd have to go back for reapproval. The other comment about that is every single time anybody touches that request, it essentially costs the organization time. And for us commercial entities here, it's every time we touch something, you know, increases our cost. It might not increase the price, but it touches our cost model. So it's important that we understand that scrutiny is not always something that results in better controlled costs. It actually sometimes induces more. And the reality of my lived experience certainly is the more scrutiny that is added, the more likely the program is to exceed its performance, budget, and capability approval. So when it's gone to an IAB with a certain described performance and a certain budget and a certain amount of allowance in terms of budget creep and a time in which to deliver, the more scrutiny that happens, the more likely it is to exceed that approval and then require reapproval, which takes further time. There are some other challenges in and around innovation, and this one's definitely close to my heart. And I loosely call this innovation aversion. You know, there are a lot of organizations out there and a lot of people saying we want innovation. But what's really clear is that the programs, particularly the lengthy programs, the bigger ones that take time to scope, get someone on contract, deliver into service, rarely are they specified with innovation in mind. There's not the room in the program to allow the flexibility of requirements that aren't defined up front. So it actually drives an aversion to innovation into the program itself and into those people responsible for delivering. In parallel to that, there's certainly a build it and they'll come focus on venues. You know, we've seen things like J-Hub, Battle Lab down in the Southwest, you know, great, you know, and they've done some really, really good work. But when you talk to some of the people involved, it's really interesting that they talk about how we've got a great venue for innovation and that it provides an opportunity for tech companies and so on to coordinate and innovate together. And, you know, and there is a requirement for some of that. But I think actually the venue is the less important place, and it's coalescing around the problem set that's more important. And I'd rather see more of that, but that kind of collaboration is much more difficult to foster. I'm sure this will be familiar to everybody, but there's certainly a valley of death between ideas and in-flight programs, and getting even in innovation that has support and funding from across research and development areas in defence, getting that into a fielded program or a program that's partly in flight for delivery is really, really tough. And we're starting to see some green shoots of this, and I really like this idea of starting with innovation and identifying the pathway, but it's kind of the outlier. It's really not the norm. And I think actually that particularly in the digital space and the intelligence space that we work in, that if you do a little bit of discovery up front and then identify the likely pathway for exploitation of that innovation, you're more likely to succeed. And yeah, if right now it's an opinion, I'd like to show some evidence, but that's probably about six months to 12 months away before I can prove that. How it feels to me, well, this is what I briefed to the Secretary of State for Defence a couple of months ago. Everyone else was talking about the challenges of, you know, the things we talked about, you know, governance, finances, lengthy programs, how slow defence is to take up SME offers. But for me, the bigger challenge here is that the programs that are in flight operate like super tankers, and innovation is a small boat threat that must be defended against at all costs, because it puts the program at risk in the minds of those people running them. And specifically in digital, if you're talking about refreshing a program that's already 5 years old, I mean, which of us commercial companies wouldn't just throw our IT away and buy new at the 5-year point. So I think there's definitely a case for shortening procurement life cycles, and also looking at programs. Again, I look at Watchkeeper, the Army unmanned aerial vehicle, and it's going through a midlife upgrade. It's been approved for another £500 million, which will take the program to 1.6 billion. And it was something that came into service in the early 2000s. The idea was generated quite a long time before that. And yet in the commercial market, you can buy capabilities that are beyond Watchkeeper for a fraction of the price. So to me, investing £500 million in an upgrade to something that's already old and probably out of date, I question the logic there. That's one of the challenges, I think. These long life cycle programs. It's true that sometimes we all struggle to deliver to defence need, and even the large companies struggle with this. Partly because requirements are out of date before the contract is even awarded. But by the time you've gone through I know CADMID has moved on, but for going from concept to assessment to demonstration to manufacture, those first 3 steps take a lot of time, and you might be delivering against a requirement that's now, particularly in the digital world, completely out of date, overtaken by events. The world has moved on. So if your requirements are out of date, but you're mandated to deliver against those requirements, and then you're mandated as an industry partner to deliver those things, you never get modern capabilities into the hands of the frontline user, and that's a real problem. And it's more true in the digital world than it is in the hardware, ships, tanks, airplanes world. There's been some interesting recent, I call them fashions, but you hear this particularly in the research areas. So frameworks such as Serapis, Astrid, rCloud, and so on. There's a strong push to bring non-traditional suppliers and SMEs and academia into the defence world. Now, I can speak with some authority here in that we work with an academic partner, and I've worked in 2 SMEs and 2 large international defence companies. Bringing non-traditional suppliers and academia into our world is really hard, particularly when the requirements for contracts might include personnel security clearances. So how many academics do we know that might have a DV, for example? You might need IT that operates at official sensitive or above. You might need a facility security clearance. You might need collaboration environments. Definitely need supply chain accreditations. You need to know the opportunities exist. You need access to the relevant framework. You need to have experience in the domain to be trusted. And you need to understand how to respond to a particular request for proposal or an RFQ. Those are very high barriers to entry. And we understand our domain, we understand how to do these things, and yet we still don't win everything we go after, because there are nuances. Every framework has its nuance of how to respond, what they're interested in. Is firm price okay? Is it better to put a day rate based price with specific deliverables? Each one has different scoring and marking guides. So if it's hard for us, can you imagine how difficult it would be for these non-traditional suppliers? So the answer is, okay, go and work with a prime, but that doesn't necessarily work at the same tempo. If you're an SME, and particularly a micro-SME, we tend to work really quickly, and we're agile, and we go after things, kill it fast, go on the new thing. Academia works at a very different pace, and is much more akin to the sort of the pace that you see in bigger industry. But this break point between those 2 speeds can be really difficult to operate within. And certainly for us as an SME, working with academia can be really tough. So I want to use an example here, and I will talk about us for a second here. And I'm using this just as a means of demonstrating there is a different way to do this. So whilst we do a lot of defence work and work in those sensitive places that I talked about before, we actually now have an unclassified, completely commercial intelligence as a service capability. We've got brokered relationships with the likes of Planet, an American company that fly lots of small sats as well as higher resolution capabilities. We've got relationships with companies that provide best of class tool sets, and of course we've got our amazing people. And we're also trying to not only build something that can service operational partners, but also provide a testing, evaluation, and discovery venue. And I talked before about people being interested in venues. What I don't mean here is a building in which this has to reside. What I mean is a capability in which to test something and using that as a test venue. But because it's unclassified, you don't worry so much about security. You don't have to worry necessarily about safety considerations and so on. You've probably got legal and governance and policy constraints you need to work in, but you can do a lot more than you might be able to do within an in-flight system. And we constantly hear challenges from MOD Centre to help us do better, do more with less, try and do this thing. So what we're trying to do is figure out a way where we can harness the amazing power of commercial ISR, the analytics and the AI that is pretty prevalent now out in the commercial world. There are 70 different providers of space-based remote sensing, and those are increasing every day. China will have more satellites in space than any other nation this time next year. And one of the things that you can do, one of the things that you can do with commercial space that you might not be able to do in the military world is monitoring at scale. And so here's an example from Planet where they actually are monitoring 3,500 sites on a daily basis because they're using automation and AI to do it. On the left-hand side, that's one of our products, and that's essentially a contingency planning pack for evacuating non-combatants from war zones. And in this case, we've picked Beirut because it's kind of relevant and topical. It's the beauty of using commercial sources is that it's instantly shareable. You can work with anybody because it's unclassified. You can put it in your pocket, and if you lose it, no one's going to shout at you. You can sit there with a local host nation person and sketch out, okay, where is this? Where's the stadium? Let's do some planning together, which is much more difficult than using traditional classified sources. So we're looking to get after this and provide a venue through which defence can learn how to do things better. I'm really glad Larry's on this call because Larry talks a lot about lifelong learning, but also learning by doing. And that's something that we're really trying to adopt. So I talk about 3 layers of learning, and this is something that came out in my research paper, in that in order to move things forward, you need to learn at these multiple layers, particularly if there's something that's triggering advanced change. So you need to learn at the policy and governance layer. So how do we enact a policy that enables this new capability? You need to understand how to govern it. What legal constraints might you have? If you're going to use a commercial source, can you use it for targeting? Probably not. Okay, so what can we do with this? You need to understand then at the operational and process layer, how do we make this new capability work with what we have? How is it shareable with other partners? How do we task it? How do we make all those things work? And then, of course, the thing that most people focus on, which is what does the technology do? How does it help the user? There's a lot of research capabilities that are looking at that particular level, but we don't tend to do the other things quite so well. And also in the traditional approach, you tend to set policy and governance up first. And I use the Defence AI Centre as an example here, where they've spent about 18 months figuring out how to govern AI in the defence world and done some great work, but it's taken 18 months to get there. And for any of us that work in analytics and AI, we know that in the commercial world, 18 months is a very, very long time. And just look how far AIs and things like ChatGPT and large language models and computer vision have moved on in those 18 months. The next thing that defence typically does is figure out how to operationally command such a capability. So we write a ConImp and a ConOp and how we're going to actually control and deliver this capability. And then when we get into delivery, we figure out how we're going to take advantage of the technology in the hands of the user. And it worries me that the user comes last in this. Now, I understand how defence procurement works, and I understand in terms of the joint user environment that's down at Northwood and how they represent the frontline users and single service representation and so on. But this is typically the process that I've witnessed and borne out by the research. And as you can see, the time to deliver is quite lengthy. I haven't put any timescales on this because it varies from program to program, but that slightly cascaded, but generally a sausage machine approach takes time. So we're espousing a completely new way of going about this. And this is why I use the example of our commercial ISR capability is we believe you should start with the user and put the technology in the hands of the user and try something, and learn from that. So by enacting a small sprint of, and I use sprint advisedly, I don't mean in the safe agile approach, but a small focused activity over a defined period of time to test out what the technology can do, but also at the same time learn how are we going to apply this in the environment we have? What can it and can't it do? How do we task it? What processes do we need to change to enable this new technology and capability to be maximized? And at the same time, or ideally, you might stagger this a little bit, but then inform policy and governance by those early sprints, and then you iterate. And it shortens the time to deliver. It means you have to learn at 3 different levels at the same time. It's really more than 3, but it means that you get the opportunity to learn from what you're doing rather than figure out how to govern something you don't have. But clearly comes with pros and cons. I think the benefits here are the change to this approach would deliver capability early. Now, you hear that in the safe agile world about early delivery. And actually, what I'm not really talking about MVPs and that sort of thing. This is about adopting more mature technologies that you could buy today. And again, look at Ukraine, where off-the-shelf drones are the current thing. But now they're flying around with 10 kilometers of fiber optic cable trailing behind them because they're all being jammed to death otherwise. That is an innovation that has been drawn from the commercial world very quickly. Of course, another benefit here is learning occurs. You actually learn at all these levels, but it's not held back by figuring out policy, governance, and concept of operations and employment and developing all those things up front. You learn those as you go, but you have to have the right focus and be setting the conditions up well to do this. And in my eyes, this is an approach that would break the current cycle of delays, scrutiny, and program slippage. I think that's a benefit. It certainly puts us in the position of being innovation-led rather than requirements-led. Now, as I said earlier on, there will always be a need to be requirements-led in some areas, but in places such as, we'll pick on commercial space, the speed at which things are changing and the speed and the rate and the pace of change, particularly in the application of analytics and large data sets, that's really, really moving faster than policy can keep up. So let's be led by innovation and see where it takes us. And in this case, policy would keep up. Challenge, well, clearly it unbalances the status quo and people are resistant to change. That's a natural human condition. And there aren't many of us that feel that constant change is a good thing. Certainly, it disrupts the current commercial processes and the controls and the scrutiny and so on. And therefore also would probably force wholesale change in the ways of working in trust and policy and governance. And using the commercial ISR as an example, at the moment, the MOD has no mechanism to trust a commercial entity with requirements that could be deemed to be sensitive. We need to look at this place here in the world. Well, you might think that's secret. Might not be. But changing that point of focus and capability, and particularly with the vast data sets that now exist in the commercial world, that the MOD currently isn't taking advantage of, but you have to change the way of working and the access, and you have to make sure you can trust. And what does trust look like for that? But also supported by policy and governance. What sort of governance do you need for working with commercial entities? It's different to if you do it all in-house, it's a very different thing. The real challenge here is that the funding is tied up in lengthy programs. The funding for imagery capabilities for defence is on a 10-year cycle. But the most important thing here is I have run a marathon and proud to say that one of the same ones that Elliot Chergi ran. But the important thing here is the time is now to stop talking and figuring out governance models and I think particularly with the way that SDR is looking to shape up, actually we just need to start something. We just need to figure out, can we learn from doing something rather than govern first? That's my approach. So that's what I've had to say. Hopefully that's resonated. I've seen some questions come up in the chat. I've tried to be deliberately, thought-provoking, maybe a little bit sort of pushy and, try and generate some challenges. I don't mind that. But I think a lot of what we've said here is pretty much well founded in terms of the research that we've done and our lived experience over the last 15 years.